In 2010, archaeologists working in central Alaska found something they weren't looking for: a fire pit at the center of an ancient residential structure containing the cremated remains of a 3-year-old child. The local Healy Lake tribe gave that child a name: Xaasaa Na, Upward Sun River Mouth Child. The excavation stopped. Researchers went into consultation with local and regional native communities before deciding together whether to continue at all. 3 years later, digging into a layer just below that cremation, they found something that would end up rewriting one of the oldest open questions in American history. 2 infant girls buried together, covered in red ochre, and eventually carrying DNA that changed the whole story of how humans first reached the Americas. For decades, the standard version of that story went like this. Sometime between 15,000 and 25,000 years ago, a group of people crossed from Siberia into Alaska over Beringia, a stretch of land that's now underwater, submerged beneath the Bering Strait. That single group became the ancestors of every indigenous population across North, Central, and South America. One migration, one founding population, clean and simple, and, for most of the last century, basically untestable, because nobody had a complete ancient genome from anywhere near the right time and place to actually check it against. The site is called Upward Sun River, known locally as Xaasaa Na, in the Tanana River Valley south of Fairbanks. Archaeologist Ben Potter led the excavations, first in 2010, then again in 2013. That second dig is where the 2 infants were found, one who had survived birth by around 6 weeks, the other a late-term fetus, somewhere around 33 weeks along, likely stillborn or born prematurely. Scientists later labeled them USR1 and USR2. Buried together in the same pit, both coated in red ochre pigment, alongside 2 stone spear points and 4 carved antler rods laid in with them. Grave goods interpreted as a small, deliberate hunting toolkit placed with children who never lived long enough to use one. Researchers later noted a striking similarity between this burial and a well-known Clovis-era infant burial in Montana called Anzac I. Similar spear points, similar antler rods, a similar idea of what belonged with a child heading into whatever came next. What made Upward Sun River different was where it happened. Most Ice Age-era burials like this one turn up in isolated ceremonial contexts. This one was inside an active residential camp where people were still living, still eating, still working. Not a separate burial ground, but a home, and that home had a working economy behind it. Around 300 salmon bone fragments were recovered from the site, the earliest confirmed evidence of salmon fishing anywhere in North America. DNA testing on those bones identified them as chum salmon, and isotope analysis showed the fish were anadromous, meaning they migrated from the ocean into freshwater rivers to spawn. The same basic salmon run pattern still recognizable in Alaska today, over 11,000 years later. There was also a single obsidian flake buried with the infants, and researchers managed to trace its exact geological source: Hoodoo Mountain, in what's now Kluane National Park in Canada's Yukon, roughly 600 kilometers away, or about 370 miles. That's not a coincidence or a curiosity. That's evidence of an established trade or travel network, moving specific, identifiable material hundreds of miles across the landscape at a site nearly 11,500 years old. None of that reads like a small, primitive, disconnected band barely surviving the edge of the Ice Age. It reads like a population with real geographic reach, seasonal food strategies, and enough social structure to carry specific tools and specific stone across hundreds of miles of unmapped terrain. Then, in 2018, came the DNA. A team led by geneticist Eske Willerslev of the University of Copenhagen and University of Cambridge, working with Potter, sequenced a full genome from Xaasaa Na, one of the oldest, most complete ancient genomes ever recovered from the Americas. They compared it against modern Native American populations and against ancient and living populations across Eurasia. What came back didn't match what anyone expected. Xaasaa wasn't ancestral to today's Native Americans. Her population was related to them, but distinct. A separate branch entirely, one nobody had known existed. Potter said it plainly afterward. They didn't know this population had existed at all. Researchers ended up naming the newly identified group the Ancient Beringians, people who share deep common ancestry with the population that became Native Americans, but who split off from that lineage and, based on the genetic evidence, didn't contribute meaningfully to the ancestry of any living indigenous population in the Americas today. Here's where it gets genuinely strange, in the best scientific sense of that phrase. The genome placed the split between the ancient Beringian lineage and the ancestors of all other Native Americans somewhere in the range of roughly 18,000 to 22,000 years ago. Later refinements to the original 2018 estimate narrowed it into that window. But humans aren't reliably documented as having reached the Americas, based on solid archaeological evidence, until around 14,600 years ago at the very earliest. That leaves a gap of several thousand years. Somewhere, some population had to stay isolated long enough to become genetically distinct from its relatives before anyone shows up in the actual archaeological record south of the ice sheets. That gap isn't just a loose end. It's direct genetic support for something researchers had already theorized without proof: the Beringian Standstill Hypothesis. The idea is that a founding population didn't just pass through Beringia quickly on their way south. They stopped there. They stayed for possibly thousands of years, isolated on that land bridge, before the ice sheets further south finally opened enough to let people continue into the rest of the continent. The genetic evidence backs this up in an unexpected way. Mitochondrial DNA diversity in the ancient Beringian population was actually higher than in modern populations descended from them, which is the genetic signature you'd expect from a large, long-standing population that later contracted and dispersed, not one that simply passed through in a hurry. Researchers laid out two competing scenarios for exactly when and how the actual split happened, and both remain live possibilities. The first, the split happened back in East Asia before anyone crossed into Beringia at all, with two already distinct groups crossing separately, maybe at different times or by different routes. The second, one single group crossed into Beringia together and only split apart afterward once they'd already arrived, some staying in the Alaskan interior and becoming the Ancient Beringians, others continuing south around 15,700 years ago to eventually populate the rest of the hemisphere. Miguel Villar, lead scientist for National Geographic's Genographic Project, offered a description of this that stuck with a lot of people since. "It's less like a tree with one trunk branching cleanly outward," he said, "and more like a river delta, streams that split apart, run separately for a while, sometimes converge again, rather than one permanent fork with a clean single answer, and the story doesn't end with just one split." Genetic evidence indicates that thousands of years later, a separate wave of ancestry moved back northward from more southern Native American populations into Alaska, mixing back in with descendants of the ancient Beringian lineage that had stayed behind the whole time. Then, sometime within roughly the last 2,500 years, that already mixed population combined again with a distinct Paleo-Siberian lineage arriving from across the strait. The ancestry pattern in modern Athabascan-speaking populations today is the end result of all of that layered contact. At least 3 separate waves of migration and mixing, not one clean founding event followed by permanent isolation. David Reich, a geneticist at Harvard Medical School who wasn't involved in the study, called the findings significant specifically because they narrowed the real range of possibilities for how the Americas were peopled, not because they handed anyone one single final answer. That distinction matters. This genome didn't settle the debate over exactly when and how people first reached the Americas. What it did was rule out the simplest version of the old story: one migration, one founding population, no complexity, no branching, and replace it with something messier and probably a lot closer to what actually happened: multiple populations splitting apart and later remixing over thousands of years, most of it happening long before anyone was leaving behind anything archaeologists could later dig up and date. There's something worth sitting with underneath all of this too. This entire discovery came from the remains of 2 infants who died over 11,500 years ago in a settlement where people were actively grieving them, coating them in red ochre, laying hunting tools in beside them, burying them together inside their own home, not apart from it. The genetic story is remarkable on its own, but it sits directly on top of a real human moment of loss at the edge of the last ice age, thousands of years before anyone could have imagined their remains would eventually help answer a question about the entire history of 2 continents. Throughout the project, researchers worked directly with local Athabascan and Healy Lake communities, not only for permission to excavate and study the remains, but for the naming itself, which is why USR1 is known, outside of scientific papers, as Xaasaa Na Gai, Sunrise Girl Child, in the Middle Tanana Athabascan dialect, and not only as a lab code. Potter, reflecting on what the discovery meant, said it would be difficult to overstate how much this newly identified population changes the picture of how ancient people came to inhabit the Americas, that the real story is markedly more complex than anyone had assumed going in. And that's really the through line here. Scientists didn't have the broad outline wrong before this. A migration out of Asia across Beringia, eventually spreading across 2 continents, that part held up fine. What broke was the assumption that it happened cleanly, in one wave, from one unified population, with a simple, single-branch family tree. 2 infant girls, buried together in red ochre inside a working salmon camp 11,500 years ago, were enough to prove that assumption wrong, and to replace it with a real history built from isolation, standstill, splitting, and remixing, stretched out over tens of thousands of years, hiding in plain sight until someone finally had the tools to read it out of the bone.